If I was asked the question, what fish do you fish for that is the hardest to catch, there would be no hesitation in saying grey mullet. If you have plenty of patience, do not mind a bit of frustration and enjoy a challenge, then grey mullet are guaranteed to provide that challenge. However, if you do not have the patience, then try for something else, because believe me, mullet can test that patience to the full and drive you mad. You can see them, but you can't catch them is a phrase I've heard many times, and many times it's come from me. However, what makes them more difficult to catch than most species? Firstly, they are intelligent. Throw bait at them on the end of a heavy visual tackle and they will ignore it. Secondly, at times they can be totally preoccupied with what they are feeding on. For example, when feeding on the maggots of the seaweed fly, as the maggots are washed into the water by a high water spring tide, hitting the rotting seaweed on the upper shoreline. On those occasions, the only thing you will catch them with is the maggots of the seaweed fly, or normal maggots, or an imitation maggot fly on fly tackle. All other conventional bait, such as bread, will be ignored. But the main reason, in my opinion, is the way they feed. They are filter feeders, mainly scooping up the sediment on the seabed and filtering the invertebrates and crustaceans. They also eat seaweed and other algae. That makes it difficult for the angler to present them with their natural food. However, the good news is mullet are adaptable and will take advantage of other food sources. Mullet love calm waters such as harbours, estuaries and creeks. When it is rough, the mullet head for deeper water, therefore calm conditions is the best time to target them. This video is about shore fishing for grey mullet at one of my local creeks that the mullet love to populate. The average mullet is small, however, despite their size, catching them is a great challenge, and I find them even more difficult to catch than the larger mullet I fish for from my local harbour wall. Okay, I'm down at one of the creeks that near me, and basically this creek is absolutely alive with mullet. There's mullet everywhere in the creek. But of course, when mullet fishing, it's always easier if you can actually locate the fish. And this little area that I'm going to fish here from the shore, this little weedy area, is an area that the mullet like to come in and feed amongst. And I often see them here. The bigger fish tend to be just on the boundary of the weed there, and some of the smaller fish, they move right in onto the beach here. And I don't know if you can see the ripples there, just indicates that there's mullet here. It's about a couple of hours before high water, and I'm going to fish here up to high water and just beyond high water, and hopefully catch a fish. But of course, if you can't actually see the mullet, you've got to find some way of attracting them to you. And that's what I normally do, is put out a few pieces of bread, or maybe a bit of bread ground bait, like a bread soup, which is put into water and mashed right up, and put that in, and maybe some few floating crusts of bread to try and attract the mullet. If I'm on the kayak, what I'll do again is make some ground bait, which will be a mixture of mackerel guts and bread, all mashed up, and pop it in an onion sack, and then hook it to the side of the kayak in the hope to attract the mullet in. But like I said, it's much easier if you can just wander the creeks and actually see the mullet by them breaking the surface, just to indicate that they're there. That makes life a lot easier than actually trying to fish blind and try to attract the mullet to you with ground bait. So this is the little area I'm going to fish. I'm going to fish from the beach here, just casting a bubble float with some floating bread crust out in the gaps of the weed here as the tide floods in. Okay, so we're going to have a go and see if I can catch one of these extremely difficult to catch grey mullet. I'm not particularly worried about the size, it's just the challenge to me of actually being able to catch one in the first place, no matter how big it is. I don't know, again, if you can see there, just see the ripples on the water. That indicates that the mullet is swimming through there amongst this weed. Probably scooping up all the little sort of floating bits of weed in the water there, and then filtering out the little crustaceans that might be in it. Alright, so we're just going to have a go. This is just what you need when you're mullet fishing. A couple of dogs that like to chase mullet. As if it isn't hard enough as it is. Try and get these fish interested in the bread. What I'm just doing is throwing out a few pieces of bread. Not too much to overfeed them, but just to try and get them to take bread. Usually once you see them, if you've located the mullet, and once you see them actually taking your offerings, pieces of bread, you know then you're in a pretty good chance of actually hooking one. It's a very, very small thick-lipped mullet. You can tell it's a thick-lipped mullet for obvious reasons. It's got the thick lip there, where the thin-lipped mullet have a thin lip. So really, really pleasing to get one. They are a nightmare to catch, but I managed to get them interested in the bread. So always satisfying when you manage to catch a grey mullet. Very, very difficult to catch, very frustrating, and very rewarding when you do catch one. So we'll get this one back. Just taking a look at the tackle I'm using for this mullet fishing from the shore. I don't go mullet fishing enough throughout the season to justify what the purists would call a proper mullet fishing tackle. So what I tend to use, I've got an old 9.5 foot spinning rod, and the reason that I find it suitable for my mullet fishing is that it's got a nice soft tip, which helps when you're actually playing the hard fighting mullet. I've got my usual 4000 size spinning reel, which is loaded with braid, but what I do for my mullet fishing is attach an 8-pound fluorocarbon leader, which is twice the length of the rod, and fluorocarbon being almost completely invisible, I find helps the sort of easy to scare, easy to spook mullet. And what I use, because I'm fishing where I've been fishing, it's very, very shallow water and there's lots and lots of weed, so it's totally impossible to fish with a conventional float and fish bait beneath the surface, because sometimes I'm only fishing in about a foot of water, and there's great patches of weed and what they call spaghetti weed, so impossible to fish bread under the surface. So what you've got to do is fish floating bread, and for that I use the usual bubble float, there, and you can fill it with water if you need a bit more weight for casting distance. But that's a bubble float, and the actual trace to the hook, I've got about 3 foot of, again, 8-pound fluorocarbon, and then tied to that it's only a size 10 hook. It depends on the size of the bait that I use. If I'm fishing off my local harbour wall where the mullet tend to be a bit bigger, I'd probably use a size 8 hook, or even a size 6 hook, while I'd be fishing much larger pieces of bread. But here, where the average mullet is quite small, and to get them to take usually requires fishing very small pieces of bread, so that's a size 10 hook. You could probably even go lower for the mullet here, the small mullet here, even to a size 12 hook, or even a size 14 hook. But that's the tackle I use for the mullet fishing here. So it's just a 9.5 foot spinning rod with a nice soft tip. It's a 4000 size spinning reel. It's loaded with braid, but more importantly, I've got an 8-pound fluorocarbon leader. Bubble float, because I'm fishing floating bread, floating crust, or floating pieces of bread. Bubble float, and then about a 3 foot trace of, again, 8-pound fluorocarbon. 6-pound would probably be even better, but I've got 8-pound, and then just a size 10 specimen hook. Another little grey mullet there. Once again, only a small fish, but really pleasing to catch another fish. They really are difficult to catch. Just got to get this fish back. Okay, I'm back down to my local creek to do a bit more mullet fishing, only this time I'm going to be fishing the low water period, whereas the previous time I was fishing up on the beach there, up to high water. At the moment it's about two hours before low water. I'm going to fish here down to low water and then fish a few hours of the flooding tide. There's usually, at low water, there's usually a few more mullet around. So hopefully I'll be able to at least get another one. As you can see there, you can see the ripples on the water there. The mullet are already here, so I don't have to go looking for them. And as usual, they're coming right into the shallows there, just feeding amongst the weed. Tactics are going to be the same. I'm going to use the bubble float. It's the only method you can fish here is the bubble float with a floating crust. Or free line of a crust of bread. It's just way too shallow to float fish with bait under the surface. At times you'll only be floating the crust over about 1 foot, 2 foot of water. And the other thing with so much weed, sometimes you have to put the crust in amongst the gaps in the weed. And there's just too much weed here to make it, and it's too shallow to be able to float fishing. If I was fishing off a harbour wall, unless I see the mullet actually feeding on the surface, then I would fish float tackle with the bait beneath the surface. But the bubble float is the method to catch them here, so that's what I'm going to use again today. Just taking a look at the way I'm baiting up these pieces of bread crust. It's pretty straightforward really, nothing complicated. Got my little size 10 hook, I'm just going to pop it through there and out there, and that's it. As long as I've got enough crust there that will actually float, that's enough. That's big enough for the mullet here. If I knew there was a much bigger mullet here, then I'd probably fish a much larger crust, maybe the size of about a 10p piece or even a 50p piece. But that's all I need here for the average size of these mullet. And also the other factor is sometimes the mullet can be really shy even at the bread, and sometimes you have to really scale down to be able to catch even big mullet. I've known when I fish for them off harbour walls that they won't take a large the usual conventional size of bread or bread crust, and I've got them when I've scaled right down and just maybe only fished a tiny piece of bread just about the size of the hook, and then managed to catch them. So it does pay to experiment. If they're a little bit shy, try scaling down and fish just tiny small pieces of bread, and sometimes you might get a take. Well, hopefully you can see the ripples of the mullet there. There's plenty of mullet here, so I don't need to go looking for them. I don't need to cast very far either. And with the bubble float, the weight of the bubble float, of course I can also add water to it as well to give me a bit more scope for casting distance. But really all I need to do is just sort of flick this out, just a gentle cast just amongst the mullet there, and just hope that one of them takes interest in the bread. Well, it's taken me a while. They've been a nightmare to try and get the tape to take the bread, but eventually, it's about an hour after low water now, I've managed to just see one or two start taking the bread. Well, would you believe it? Would you believe it? It's not a mullet. Ha! It's a little bass on bread, and he's, oh my god, he's only just hooked. Well, there's a first for me. Tiny little bass on bread. Amazing. Just hooked, look at that, literally slight too much of a tug and that would have been out. There we are, bass on bread. I'm fishing for mullet. Obviously going to put this lovely little bass back. Well, I didn't get anything around the low water time apart from that bass, but I persisted, which just shows what you have to do with mullet fishing. And we're leading a couple of hours before high water again now, and I've managed to hook one, which is really pleasing. So it's taken me about 4 hours to hook one fish, and this is a slightly better quality fish, which is also pleasing. And it's not a big fish again, but it's a better quality fish than the first two I caught the previous time. I've just got to take my time with this fish and get it in. But this is mullet fishing through and through. It just takes an enormous amount of patience to get one, and persistence. I've got the clutch set really lightly. I don't want to bully this fish in. They have actually got a tougher mouth than people think, but however you can't bully them. Particularly as I haven't got a proper mullet. This is not a proper mullet rod. It's got a soft tip, but it's nowhere near as soft. It's nowhere near as soft as a proper mullet rod. And mullet do fight really well, and now it's a bit of a problem because I've got it tangled around a load of weed, which isn't going to help. I'm going to have to and I haven't got a net with me, so I'm just going to beach this fish in. Oop, it's not ready yet. So there you go, lovely little grey mullet. Again, not a huge fish. It's still a small fish, but it's slightly better quality fish than the previous two. Lovely fish, and once again, there's the thick lip there, which is why they're called thick lip. The top lip there, why they're called thick lip grey mullet. Beautiful fish. They're great sport to fish for. But as I say, you just need a huge amount of patience. 5:10 now. I started fishing at 11 o'clock, so that's taken me 6 hours to catch that fish. I did manage to hook one, but I didn't hook it properly. It got off, and then just the bass. So that's what it takes to catch mullet, and as I say, get this one back safely. Give it a bit of time to recover. Mullet, I have occasionally taken them for the table in the past, but it depends where you catch them from. To me, they've got the underlying earthy taste, which I'm not that keen on. If I catch them from open water, maybe off of a beach that faces the open sea, they tend to be a bit less earthy. Then there it goes. Less earthy than ones caught in the creeks and the estuary, where of course they're filtering mud. So these days I don't usually take mullet, I just return them and just fish for them for the sport and the challenge of catching them. Okay, I'm going to call it a day now. That's 3 mullet from 2 sessions, so I'm really pleased. Today's session was particularly difficult, but that just goes to show what it takes to catch mullet. You need a huge amount of patience. But when you do catch one, it's really rewarding, because you can spend hours, you can see the fish, sometimes you can see great shoals of them, but you just cannot get them interested in the bait when they're preoccupied in fishing and feeding on whatever they're feeding on. But even at times when you do get them interested in the bread, you've still got to hook them, and they nibble away at that bread, and it's just timing it right, timing that strike right to hook one. And many times I've felt the fish but haven't quite hooked it properly, and they've got away. So great challenge, and pleasing when it goes well. And many thanks for watching.